Oh, good morning to everyone.
Morning.
Good morning.
Very nice sunny day outside. I did want to mention, because I mentioned when a couple weeks ago talking about selection of leaders, I just thought I'd mention primary election is Tuesday. And a lot of times I feel like, with some good reason, we as Christians, if we do vote, get to the general election and we're like, oh, both of these candidates stink. I don't really like either of them. Well, the primary election is when you have a larger choice of candidates and you can usually select the more perfect candidate. But all the unfortunate thing is a lot of people don't actually vote in the primary election. So it kind of gets overlooked. So just a little thought, and I would encourage to be in prayer for those elections, and obviously for the general election when it comes up in November. So last week, Papap talked to us a little bit about the laws of warfare and laws concerning eligibility for the military. There were a couple commands given to the Israelites that were meant to help preserve their people, the family's inheritance, the families themselves. For instance, if a man had just finished a house, married, or if he was just too flat out afraid and would have hurt morale among the Israelite troops, he didn't have to go to war. And some of this was because, again, Israel's not defending itself just on its own. It's being defended with God's help above all else. Matthew, can you plug in the little transceiver? I just realized I think I had it in charging and I didn't plug it back in. It just needs the auxiliary cord plugged in and turned on. Thanks. So this week we're going to be looking at a couple semi-related, semi-unrelated examples of case law, and what I want us to understand from these is a couple of things. Number one, a lot of critics of the Bible will try to say that these are statements of how God intended things to be, and I would make the argument that that's not necessarily the case. Some of those critics will point to one of these in verse 15 talks about if a man has two wives and therefore two firstborn sons, one by either wife, he's not allowed to just favor one over the other because he preferred one wife over the other. He has to give the firstborn son, the eldest of the two, the inheritance of the firstborn. We'll get more into that in a moment. But some critics say that justifies polygamy, and what I'm going to argue this morning is that if you look in context, no. These are case law examples for when things are already bad or things are already not as they're supposed to be. How do you move forward to get the best outcome possible? I think that's a better way to frame a lot of these examples that we see in Deuteronomy. So we'll get into the first one is related to some of what we've talked about with murder and manslaughter the last couple weeks. But before we get into it, we'll go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful for this morning that you've blessed us with to come study from your word. We pray your blessing on our study together, and we are thankful for the many blessings that you've given to us in this wonderful day. And it's in your son's name we pray and give you thanks. Amen. So the first 9 verses are this first kind of case law example. And from this point on in Deuteronomy, the chapters, you'll notice, start to be, it's not that the chapters change in size so much, but they get to have more and more sections inside them. So whereas before, when we talked about the city of refuge, that was basically one half of the chapter, and the second half was about property, about landmarks, and why the Israelites are not supposed to move the landmarks that mark out their individual pieces of land. We're going to start getting into smaller verse-by-verse kind of examples. So we'll have a 9-verse case, a 3-verse, 4-verse, and I believe there's either 5 or 6 total in chapter 21. So, do we have a volunteer to start us off with reading verses 1 through 9? Oh, Jania, thank you.
If a man is found slain, lying in the field in the land the Lord your God is giving to you to possess, and it is not known who killed him, your elders and judges shall go out and measure the distance from the body to the neighboring towns. Then the elders of the town nearest the body shall take a heifer that has never been worked and has never worn a yoke, and will lead her down to the valley that has not been plowed or planted, and where there is a flowing stream. There in the valley they are to break the heifer's neck. The priest, the sons of Levi, shall step forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister and to pronounce blessings in the name of the Lord, and to decide all the cases of dispute and assault. Then all the elders of the town nearest the body shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley. And they shall declare, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Accept this atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed. O Lord, and do not hold your people guilty of the blood of an innocent man, and the blood shed will be atoned for. So you will purge from yourselves the guilt of shedding innocent blood, since you have done what is right in the eyes of the Lord.
Thank you. So a few of these examples as we continue on, they're going to seem strange, and critics of the Bible do like to cherry pick them. And there's two main reasons I think that happens. Number one is just not thinking through it fully. This is a good idea given the circumstances. The other one, I think, is more the case with this verse. It just seems odd that because we don't really do anything like this in our society. If we find a body and there's no cameras, there's no knowledge of what could have happened that led to the death of that person, we're more likely to have a folder of a cold case in a filing box somewhere with law enforcement. We don't do anything like this where the higher up judges and the priests come down and they break the neck of a heifer in a valley and do a ritual washing over it. We don't have anything really analogous to this in our modern society. So it just seems strange to us. But here, as we talked about with the cities of refuge, we talked about how important it was to recognize that whether a death was intended or not, God wanted the Israelites to see that as something very important and very serious that could not just be looked over. Even if the death was accidental, it had to be addressed in some way. There had to be something done about it. And we see that same logic extend here. Now, in this case, if someone's found in the middle of the woods or middle of a field and it looks like the body's been there a couple days, there's no closed circuit television in ancient Israel. If it's far away from any city, as is kind of assumed here, they may never be able to find who did this unless someone actually confessed to it. Or if later on someone does happen to be a witness. But even then, you need 2 or 3 witnesses to actually do anything about it legally. And so chances were, if this body's found outside the city, they're not going to be able to solve the murder, even if they saw that it looks like a murder happened. So what God instructs them to do is they bring out elders from some of the surrounding cities, and almost kind of like a little committee is responsible for taking care of it. The first committee, they look at the distance to each city, and whichever one is closest, that's the one that's going to have to perform the rite because it makes the most sense. They're closest, they're the most likely. I'll get in a moment. And then from there, those elders and the priests are going to perform this ritual cleansing.
It also sounds like they don't even know the identity of the person for some reason. So he may have just been a passer through and someone in his group killed him and left him there. Because they have to pick based on what city he's closer to. I would think that if one of those three or however many towns show up, if they say, "Oh, that's Joe," you know, then they would probably take care of the whole thing
Yeah.
because he's from their.
Either that, or if they actually identify the person, they might know like his list of enemies. They might know somewhere to start when they're supposed to thoroughly search out the matter. They could at least look at it a little bit. But that aside, if that turns up nothing, they may still have to perform this rite anyways. But yeah, good point on that. Did you have something?
I had a thought. It might be important for them to know whose land is closest. Because isn't there like a curse with bloodshed if the land is cursed? So you would want to make sure that it wasn't part of your area could be cursed. You'd want to make sure this was better.
This is
Chief off that.
Yeah, this is under the concept of purge the evil from
Mhm.
among you.
Yeah, and it says so in verse 9 that in this case, I will note that verse 9 is slightly different than purge the evil. It's so that you'll remove the guilt of innocent blood. It's not quite rising to the same level of evil as before because they don't really know and they don't have a way to know what happened or who done it.
Yeah, they didn't get to punish the evil,
But
so they're not purging the
yes.
evil, they're purging the guilt.
Yes, but because there's still a death and presumably there was a murder, they just don't know how it happened. It's still something that has to be addressed. They can't just brush it over. Now, the rite that's performed, I'm assuming they would try to find, so it says they have to go to a valley with water running through it that's not been developed. No plowing, no farming. And I don't has to be nearby. I'm presuming they would have tried to do something nearby just out of convenience, but perhaps if you live in some of the very flattest parts of Israel, perhaps you have to even travel a little bit to find a valley with water running through it. Or maybe they eventually developed one area where they tended to go to perform this rite all the time. The interesting thing about this, and I keep calling it a rite because it's not really a sacrifice per se. With most of the sacrifices, there's usually the shedding of the animal's blood. There's usually an altar. Part of the sacrifice is usually burned because that's how it'd be presented before the Lord. In this case, they break the neck of the heifer, so there's no blood. They wash their hands over it, but there's no sacrifice. There's no eating of the heifer. A lot of the sacrifices they would do, part of it would be burned, and then part of it they would enjoy a small feast.
So it sounds like it's almost like the guilt of the unknown perpetrator is transferred to the animal, and symbolically, and then the leaders say we did the best we could. We were washing our hands of the matter.
Yeah,
and we're innocent now.
That's probably the most likely indication of, or not indication, but the most likely symbolism in this. And again, as stated, that they had to really not know who could have done this. I'm thinking by this point because they're saying we don't know. They've already tried to search out the matter. And finally, this had to be done in the priest's presence, and we've been talking the last couple weeks about how Levites or priests might have been judges in the Old Testament, and this verse 5 actually has probably some of the strongest evidence of that because it talks about the priests, the sons of Levi, chosen to serve God, and it says that by them every dispute and every assault shall be settled by them. So at some point up the chain of command in terms of legal authority, they're the judges in Israel. And so this had to be done in both the presence of representative of the highest civil authority and the highest religious authority. So a very important rite. And then they still ask for God forgiveness, even though none of the elders there were the ones who did it. There's still sin among the land, and so they have to ask forgiveness from God on behalf of the land. Now, one interesting note about Jewish tradition I did find, their traditional interpretation of this said that the field, it had to be unplanted, undeveloped before they performed the rite in order for them to use that valley. The way that they traditionally would exercise it, the field could not be planted or developed unless the murderer was found after the fact and executed, and then they could open up that valley again. That's not Bible. That's just how the Jews traditionally interpreted the passage, but I just thought it was interesting. So that's the first case. Now we move to the second case, which is one of the ones that critics of the Bible like to bring up a lot. And this is the one not necessarily because it's weird, but because they'll try to point out that it offends our notion of what we think justice or fairness is supposed to be in terms of the Bible. And there's always this heavy implication that these kinds of things go against what God said to do and other commands. I think if we actually carefully look at the verses, we aren't going to see that. And on top of that, what is commanded here is far, as we'll talk about, is far better than anything else you would have found from any other country in the ancient Near East. So this has to do with with captives in a time of war, particularly female captives, who, if you know anything about the history of war, are generally not treated well whenever a city is sacked and burned and the city's army is defeated. There were no rules of war. There's no protection, no prisoner of war camp. There's no Geneva Convention during the time of the Assyrians or the Babylonians. And so the female captives in the ancient Near East would be treated however the fit. God radically changed that with these 4 verses for the nation of Israel. And it's the founding it's a founding principle that has led to things like the Geneva Conventions, what we would think of as rules of war that lots of European countries would follow even in World War II. If the Germans captured groups of our soldiers, they'd be given some basic level of medical attention. There's even stories of where they'd put maggots on potential gangrene infections. And the way that maggots are, they only eat the dead stuff. They leave the living tissue, and then they grow up, fly away, and you might actually save the arm that way, as weird as that sounds. But we have stories of the Germans doing that. And so a lot of European countries around World War I, World War II, they'd follow these kinds of conventions. That didn't hold true across all cultures in World War II or even since then. But any of those kinds of conventions or rules of war really stem from this. So with that, we'll go ahead and read the verses. This is verses 10 to 14. Do we have a volunteer for those? All right, Mom. Thank you.
When you go out to battle against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take them away captive, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and have a desire for her, and would take her as a wife for yourself, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall also remove the clothes of her captivity, and shall remain in your house, and mourn her father and mother a full month. And after that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you are not pleased with her, then you shall let her go, wherever she wishes. But you shall certainly not sell her for money. You shall not mistreat her, because you have humbled her.
Thank you. So first question about this, it talks about female captives. Why does it not talk about male captives of war? Because they're dead.
Yeah.
That's
No,
the
or
most
they're just
likely reason.
into forced labor.
Or forced labor. Those would be the
They're not
two main
legally
reasons. No. And especially because women wouldn't have done the fighting in ancient Israel. So that's why men aren't mentioned. But next thing, the Israelite soldier, he's not allowed to just force himself on a female victim of war. If he is attracted to her, there's a way that he is allowed to make her his wife, but that's the only way that that's the only means allowed. If he hadn't done that, the same laws for rape would have applied, and he would face the sentence of death. If he just takes her and disobeys the particular ways that this is laid out, it could be, I think, guilty of kidnapping, which also carried the sentence of death. And then down at the end, this is probably the craziest part in verse 14, and probably the most different from any other culture, is that if the man had taken the female victim, he goes through the rite, and then after 30 days, he realizes, oh, this was all heat of war. I'm not really that attracted to her. He's not allowed to make her a sex slave. He's not allowed to sell her into slavery. He has to let her go. And that would have been absolutely anathema to any other culture in the ancient Near East. Assyria and Babylon were not doing that.
Yeah, they definitely would have made her a slave.
It either would have made her a slave, they would have killed her, they would have sold her to someone else. You weren't allowed to do any of that in Israel.
She could
That I don't
marry
know.
someone else, or she could be. Yeah, she probably wouldn't have a lot of options.
Yeah, it's not like there'd be a city to go back to, but she could conceivably maybe get married somewhere else. Maybe if her city was destroyed, there's other cities from the same country that are still around, and she might be able to go back to her people there. But it's still leaps and bounds better than any other practice that any other country would have had at this time. As also noted, she's given 30 days to mourn separation from her parents or the death of her parents. And as I mentioned, any deviation from this and other penalties from the law are going to. Another thing that is often left out when critics of the Bible will take a passage like this, they'll usually interpret it in the most unfriendly light possible. They won't read in things like, they'll say that, oh, well, this could lead to polygamy. Like, there's other provisions that say you're not supposed to take another wife if you already have one. They did still do it, though, but it wasn't lawful. What we're dealing with, I think most when we're talking about this, isn't how the individual Israelites followed or didn't follow the law. It's how God commanded the law, because the thing that critics are trying to impugn is God's character, because they think if they can impugn God's character and he's not perfect, well, then we don't have to follow the Bible. And the problem is that's not true.
One of the really wise provisions is that she's forced to basically change her appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So the hair, the way she keeps herself, her clothing, it all changes. If cutting her nails, and the idea would be, okay, if he sees this exotic-looking woman who maybe dresses nicer than the typical Israelite woman, he's gonna think, "Wow, what a beautiful woman." But after 30 days of seeing her in the changed state, he's like, "Oh, well, she's not really any prettier than the Israelite women. Why was I thinking about marrying her or taking her?" So it would maybe prevent him from making a bad decision based on lust.
Yeah. And then the second, I almost forgot this, with removing the garments, different effects, makeup, some of that stuff could have been particular dress for pagan rituals as well. And this would removing the old. Now, the one thing I'm still fuzzy on, it talks about having her remove the garments of her captivity. And I'm not sure, the clothes of her captivity, I'm not sure that that refers to whatever the Israelites would have given her to wear. I'm still wondering if that has to do with just what she's taken in whatever she would have been wearing when the city was attacked. Because depending on who she was or where she was in the city, if she was in service to that city's priest, she could be wearing pagan clothing, certain jewelry used for pagan rituals. That would be another reason to get rid of those things, is kind of the purging the evil from among you type attitude that God talks about. Did I see a hand over here?
To me, it seems like you're clothing her and feeding her more. That not.
Yes. Yeah, that is the presumption here. So, like I said, kind of a complicated little thing. Something that I don't think impugns God's character at all. I don't think it contradicts anything that we've seen, and it reads perfectly well with other laws that we've seen regarding kidnapping, regarding rape, regarding polygamy. All of that read together, this is not only reasonable, this is exceptional for the time that it's written in, and keeps in line with God's moral standards.
They didn't have options to have prisons and camps and things like that. They were in a totally different situation where everyone's just barely surviving in an agrarian society. And when they came in conflict and there was a war or a battle, either people are going to be made to be forced laborers, or they're going to be taken like this. She probably, in the long run, this ended up being better for her. Either if she remained married or if she was freed and went on to do what she wanted to do.
Yeah. And like I mentioned at the beginning, with a lot of these cases, it's unfortunate circumstances. It's the circumstances they would have been in, and it's doing the best they can in the case that they're given. Obviously, open war is not the immediate preferred option.
War is not ever going to have good outcomes.
Yeah, and this is why when we get to the next one, this is one passage, verses 15 to 17, as I mentioned. It's one that some critics will try to say that the Bible is openly endorsing polygamy. And I think it's very clear. If you look at the context, the immediately preceding passage has to do with war. The one before that has to do with an unsolved murder. None of these are ideal circumstances. These are all, we're in a tough spot. What do we do to try to get the most just, most beneficial outcome for the different parties involved when we're already in a tough situation? Now, I will say this situation probably is not as tough. It's just an Israelite man needing to realize that certain things are already decided and he's not allowed to change that decision. And this has to do with two firstborns. So do we have a volunteer for verses 15 to 17? All right, Carol, thank you. Thank you. So again, this is not an endorsement of polygamy, and the reason I say that is not just for the what if you're in this situation, but secondly, because there's many ways to interpret a man having had two wives and it not be polygamy. There were lawful means of divorce in the law of Moses, so that could be one way. The second is that of a widower. The man had a wife, had a son with her, she dies, and then marries again, has a son with her, and maybe he does like the wife that's currently living more than his previous wife. What this passage is saying is because of that, the man's not allowed to deny his eldest son from both wives or between both wives. He's not allowed to deny his eldest son his birthright. Uh, he's the oldest, and the choice to take the double portion away from him and give it to the other firstborn son, that's not an option that exists under the law.
This could definitely be divorce because unloved that often would have resulted in divorce.
That would be one. Now, I think it does also apply in cases of polygamy because, as Dad mentioned, we know that the Israelites did not always follow that prohibition. The prophet Samuel, his father, had 2 wives who were alive at the same time. And this same kind of law would have applied here. We know that the one, I can't remember the other wife's name off the top of my head, but Samuel's mom is Hannah, and something like that. But basically, what this law is saying is that Elkanah would not have had the option to transfer Peniel's firstborn inheritance rights to Samuel. Now, that was not something that Elkanah was worried about, especially because Hannah had promised God that if she had a son, the firstborn would be given to the temple service. That ended up being Samuel, and she followed through with that promise she made to God. But it is worth seeing that this kind of dispute would have been likely, because if a man particularly liked this wife more than the other wife, if they're alive at the same time, the right of the firstborn was a lot. He got a double portion, which either meant he got twice as much as any other son, or he got half, and then the other sons got to divvy up whatever was left. So whoever had the inheritance of the firstborn, regardless, is going to be a lot better off than any of the other sons in terms of wealth and inheritance. Yeah, Rachel and also their 2 concubines.
And under this, he couldn't have favored Joseph or Benjamin
over Reuben. Yes, which, if that had happened under the law of Moses, could have, I don't know, might have even been more likely thing, because we know that Jacob had a very strong favoritism towards Joseph that caused a lot of trouble. But I think that's about all that I had on that. Next one. This is another one that critics say is excessively harsh. And that, I think, has to do with just not understanding what all is actually being said in this passage. This is about rebellious children, and there's a death penalty assigned with this kind of rebelliousness. But I think what we see with the passage when we read is this type of rebelliousness is very specific. It's not just your kid refused to clean his room, and now we're going to stone him to death. That's not what it is at all. And so we'll read this, and then we'll get into that. Do we have a volunteer for verses 18 to 21? Oh, Landra? Thank you.
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them and discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. He must purge the evil from the family. All Israel hear of it."
Thank you. Profligate must be another translation. Mine says glutton and drunkard.
Profligate is someone who just very will just waste stuff.
Yeah. Basically, or prodigal kind of thing. So this passage is not simply someone rebellious. It talks about how simple punishment is not working in this case. But it's not just that. It's something, whatever is happening must be so bad that the civil authority is having to get involved. This is the equivalent of having to get CPS, a parent having to, I don't know if CPS would be the exact department for this, but the parent is having to get the state's help in dealing with their own child. So something is exceedingly wrong in this case. This statement of what they're proving to the town authorities, that the son is a glutton and a drunkard, I think this also had a particular kind of idiom meaning for the Israelites. And the reason I say that is when Jesus is talking about the religious leaders and how they are very unfair in their standards towards him and John the Baptist, he talks about how they said John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and they said he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard. So considering that whatever they're saying about him is kind of related to this he has a demon kind of thing, I think a glutton and a drunkard had a particular meaning for them, and it was something bad. I know there's a lot of commentary that talks about the usual reasoning behind why the civil authorities would have to get involved is that this child may have physically harmed his parents, tried to kill them when they confronted him about his misdeeds. We also see in verse 20 that the rebelliousness is a particular kind of stubborn rebelliousness. So overall, this is not, as I said, it's not a kid refusing to clean his room or not doing the dishes, and then his parents punish him and he gets along with it from there. This is something repeated and horrible enough that the civil authority has to get involved. And the parents have to be the ones willing to bring the charge. So I really think that this means there must have been some grave threat to the parents that they were facing from this child that would warrant them going and seeking the elders' help in the town.
If they're this desperate, it's really bad.
Yes.
And it's probably not like a young child either. It's not
Yes, because if it's like a 5-year-old, family probably doesn't face a grave threat. You can control what a 5-year-old does pretty well. Did I see a hand over here?
I was going to say, also, if they're old, the chances of this actually being carried out, that somebody who is rebellious is hanging around long enough for their parents to take them to the elders. I don't see that happening. I see them running away.
Yep.
It actually never happened.
And I would think within this whole matter, there's opportunities for this child to repent. As soon as he sees his parents are actually willing to go to the town authorities to initiate this process, that's probably the biggest wake-up call of, oh, my life is now in danger with the civil authority because of my own misdeeds. I better shape up. I'm thinking that's what would have happened. And this is, again, we've talked about this before. This is one of those kind of case law examples where we never see anything like this happen in the Bible. As far as I'm aware, in Jewish tradition, there's not an actual case where this happened and it led to an execution. We know that this idiom of a glutton and a drunkard hangs around Jewish society, but beyond that, happened. And the last one, I'll read this quickly so we can finish up. This is a little bit to do with executions and the extent to which they could happen. They could only happen within a certain time frame. Couldn't be something drawn out over days. It had to be something that would have been relatively swift. And that's what we read here, verse 22 and 23. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, His corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So again, we see how awful death is, that even when after a proper trial as the necessary punishment for a heinous crime, if an execution is carried out, it has to happen, and the burial has to happen within a day. Otherwise, that itself could lead to a curse. So you can't have any kind of long, drawn-out, torturous punishment. This had to be something quick because the execution had to happen and the burial had to happen within one day. And that's generally going to be daylight, especially because in Jewish culture, I believe sundown marks the start of the next day. I don't know if that's necessarily supposed to be read in or not, but I think it's reasonable to think that they have to conclude all this before nightfall. Then imagine being here in the middle of December, you have like almost no time to carry out any of it at all. The sun goes down at like 4 o'clock. But these kinds of executions were not supposed to be macabre. They were supposed to be solemn reminders of God's justice so that the people would be afraid of sin, and then the matter was supposed to be finalized and cleaned up quickly. Otherwise, the executioners themselves and society at large, they may face a curse from God. Now, those of you for a lot of you, whoever is hanged is accursed of God might sound familiar because this is talked about in regards to Jesus, and why we bring this up a lot. Crucifixion is one of the most horrific punishments in all of history. I think the Romans almost certainly went past their kind of 1 day threshold, because they start all the trial and putting him on the cross and all that the previous evening. At least as much as it within the Jews' power, Jesus is put on the cross. He dies around morning to midday, and then Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate, and they very quickly get him in the tomb. Some of that because I believe it's the Sabbath the next day. Yeah.
They're trying to follow this.
Yeah, and they're trying to follow this. As much as the Romans would drag out the process, the Israelites still tried to follow the law as much as they could, even in that circumstance. And this even goes into an interesting evidence about Jesus, and why the gospel accounts should be understood to be true, is that if it was already would have been crazy in the Jewish mind that the Messiah would have died, for one thing, but that he would die in quite possibly the worst and most accursed way possible is another matter entirely that no Jewish writer in the first century would have made up. It's only something that could have been relaying true events. So we'll leave that there. A lot of good discussion this morning. Any final questions before we close this morning? Yeah, that's about Levirate marriage. I can't remember if Deuteronomy's going to. Yeah, if he died without an heir specifically. That's another example of case law dealing with a really tough circumstance, because that woman, if she doesn't have a son, that's almost a death sentence, because someone's got to work whatever land she has. Someone's got to provide for her when she gets older. And if she doesn't have an heir to do that,
It's going to make life difficult.
it's going to make life difficult or almost impossible for her later on. So that's usually the particular reason behind that
But
command.
that law wouldn't cover this, because if he had a son by that son would get his dad's inheritance, not his.
I didn't
The
follow.
only reason for the Levirate marriage was to have a son, and it was named the first brothers.
Yeah.
Not named
So,
biological.
the land that came from the brother through his wife would go to that son.
Would go to that
It
family.
wouldn't involve
Yes.
any of his other sons.
Any others?
We've been doing Samuel with the kids in Sunday school, and Eli knew that his two sons, Hophni and Phineas, I can't remember.
Yeah, I think Hophni
Oh, yeah,
and Phineas.
That they were bad, and he kind of talks to them, but he doesn't stop them. And then a prophet comes and tells him he's going to die too because he did not stop his sons. He knew they were being wicked and evil and rebellious, and he just let them continue to increase, and it caused a lot of problems with the whole nation.
Yeah. When you talk about stubborn, rebellious, glutton, and drunkards, that's Hophni and Phineas. If you've ever read that story. They would sleep around with the women who were supposed to be working at the temple and supposed to have dedicated their lives to God's service. They did all kinds of horrible things.
They'd eat the sacrifices.
They would eat the parts of it. Wasn't that they ate the sacrifices? It's that they would eat the parts of the sacrifices that were supposed to be left to God. Certain fat portions, I believe it was, were supposed to be left to God, and they would steal from God directly. Eli did not stop it. So anyway, that's Nadab and Abihu. Those are the sons of Aaron. They defy God and try to offer sacrifice in the way that God said not to. Kind of the presumption from it is that they were kind of rubbing it in God's face too, and offering strange fire. Yeah, he would have known about that example too. So anyway, good questions. We'll go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for the day that you blessed us with to come study from your word. We pray that you help us as we try to understand even the difficult passages of the Bible. But we're thankful that there's still things we can learn from them. And as we read in the end verses there of what your son had to go through, we're made even more grateful for his sacrifice. Thankful for this day and your blessings. And it's in your son's name we pray and give you thanks. Amen.
No, that's all.